linger in. We'll let them linger in. I didn't introduce myself, but I think everybody knows me. My name's Corey Sharp, and I have the pleasure of being the director of the Redevelopment Commission, and it's been a fantastic journey. Along with me tonight are on Zoom are our Ice Miller presenters, Brian Christ and Heather James. I'll do a formal introduction later. This is going to be a jam-packed evening. I will take no offense if you feel like you're exhausted and need to go get a burger and come back later or check in online later. Thankfully, John is with us, and we will have the capability of referring back to this in real time on YouTube, just like all of our other RDC meetings. So this is the run of the show for this evening. But before we get started, I just wanted to say a big thank you to Cindy and our Crow team. They are our financial backstop, and Cindy is here in the town hall. So if you have any financial questions, she or I or the folks at Crow can help you. Our hope is to use this as an education forum. Brian is going to start out with what does the RDC have the capability to do? And then Heather is a bond attorney and will talk about TIF and the bond process. Over the last year, we actually haven't done any bond work. And so coming this next year, we have one request in the pipeline that I'll touch on at the very end of the presentation. But these are our lovely presenters on all of the legal matters for this evening. Heather James, as I mentioned, and Brian Christ, they are both partners at Ice Miller. And Heather is sick as a dog. So we agreed that it's better for her to present remote. And Brian had already had plans in another location this evening, but is carving out some time for us to make this presentation. So I'm going to turn it right over to Brian, and then Heather is going to pick up, and then I'll close out, and then we'll finish the evening with question and answers. Sound okay? Okay. Brian, I'll turn it over to you. Brian Christ.
Oh, sorry.
He's muted?
I was on mute. Sorry about that.
Unmute yourself, Brian.
Yes. Hello?
Can you do that, John, for him?
Can you hear me? I unmuted.
I can hear you, Brian.
Okay. Can you hear me?
Brian,
Yep.
unmute yourself.
I am unmuted.
I can't even see him, which is the weirdest thing.
Yeah,
Hello?
I can hear you just fine, Brian. Let me see if I can message Corey.
Yep. Can you hear me?
I still can.
It's everywhere. We didn't really know how. We were originally going to just use that, and Heather and I were the slides up there, but now that Heather's remote and we're going to record this, then so you can face any direction.
Hello? Can you hear me?
Okay. John, Heather says that she can hear him. Okay.
I'm going to try and turn off this overhead light here too in the room because it looks like it's getting a glare on the camera. Let's see if this works. Wait a second here. Let's see.
Okay. While John works on that, we'll just reshuffle the deck, and I'll go first because I'm assuming, John, you can't hear Heather either.
Can you hear me?
Okay. Reshuffle. You guys might appreciate starting here anyways, because the rest of it is all legal talk. Okay, my section was the RDC in action and what we are currently working on. So, Heather and Brian are gonna do some tee up for this on the back end, but Heather's gonna do some great explanations on what is an economic development area and what is an allocation area. She will describe that. But currently, Zionsville has these economic development areas, and they are scattered across the jurisdiction from basically the I-65, I-465, and Michigan corridors, and Oak Street. The RDC has the capability to create economic development areas anywhere within the jurisdiction, along with multiple other commission approvals. So that will require Plan Commission, Economic Development Commission, and council approval to actually create an economic development area. So within that area, those specific areas, we are responsible for basically receiving the property tax revenue that comes in. And Cindy is the primary person that manages that. And then Tim and Becca help us understand debt obligation and bonding capacity from the financial side. All told, the RDC manages a $7.5 million budget. And we have $1.46 million of debt obligation annually. And for next year, we have $2.3 million of expenses. And those are primarily budgeted for work in the Zionsville Gateway area through professional services, work associated with the READY grant, and also one expense that is not associated with bond debt. I feel weird talking about this earlier because you all are supposed to know what bond debt is, and yeah, because oh, good, they can hear me. Good. So we in the Oak Street EDA area, the TIF that comes in annually for that also helps go towards the town mortgage, the town hall mortgage, which is different than TIF bond debt obligation. So we have a net balance at the end of the year, all in, of $3.7 million. And then I've got a breakout here of the pass-through. And I wanted to point this out specifically because this is where developers have a developer-backed bond versus a bond that's the town is responsible for paying. So this is basically land sale, operations, and TIF revenue in, and bond obligations, and then a CDC grant. This does not include any anticipated public-private partnership projects. So those anticipated public-private partnerships, also called P3, involve lots of different areas in town. The first area is Creekside. The RDC owns the lands that has all of the yellow circles on them. These are all actively for sale. And we currently have an offer on 3 of the lots. And we have we're having some conversations with interested people for lots 1, which is this one, lots 7, 8, and then 9. We had an interested party and had a little bit of a bittersweet instance last month where they pulled back their offer and are actually going to locate right on Bennett Parkway. So that gives us the opportunity to continue to pursue someone for lot 9, as it's referred to. Another project that the RDC is responsible for is what we call lot 2, which is the town hall grass lot right out front. We received multiple proposals earlier this year for this lot 2. Lot 2 on this map is basically right here. I'm showing one of the proposals that was presented at an RDC meeting. This is the Seek Property Group. They are the same group that owns this building right here. It is a financial and optometrist. Thank you. Their proposal was thinking outside the box, which is something that we encouraged in the request for information. And they also included a proposal for residential townhomes along the trail and a concept for a park experience along the trail as well. So as we work through those offers that came in and negotiating with these folks and the existing property owners in the area, just understanding how we can manage their parking needs along with how big they want the project to be. This is the renderings that you see are the renderings that they submitted as a part of their proposal. The primary focus area for next year for the RDC will be the area south of Sycamore Street and along First. This area is a part of the comprehensive plan, and the plan that was adopted was called the Zionsville Gateway Master Plan. Going forward, as we talk about it in the public, we'll refer to this area as the South Village. I wanted to highlight this specific master plan, though, because in the document, they proposed 3 different options. I'm curious, John, were you a part? Not you, John, your neighbor, John. Did you take part of this process during the Gateway Master Plan when it went through? I think that was about 4 years ago that it started going through. Yeah. Mr. Townsend is who I was talking to. Yeah. Okay. Did anybody else? Yeah. Okay, great. So I actually had a coffee with someone also that actually randomly asked me about the Zionsville Gateway Master Plan. She said, we did that so long ago. What's going on with that? So every time that I'm out in the public, I try to bring it back out, show these 3 options. The process that was done as a part of this master plan was Delve, who is an architectural firm, and a couple of their partners live here in town, had public meetings, online public input, and created this plan based on the input that they received throughout the process. And in it, it includes residential, mixed use spaces, green space, and then areas for a public plaza. And you can see that they're all organized different. The mixed use spaces are orange on these slides. Also, well, don't refer to the letters are specific lots as they're referred to in this plan. The key takeaway for this master plan that the town has been actively working on is with the READY grant. And the READY grant that was received by the town earlier this year was $1.9 million. All of that funding that was received from the IEDC is going towards engineering and design of the First Street realignment, which shows a jog instead of Main Street having this strong connection here. The strong connection is at First and Sycamore. Currently, the engineers are under contract and they are evaluating how to move traffic through this area of town, especially since it is such a congested area today. So they're taking into considerations today's traffic movement and future movement. So specifically for this intersection, they are evaluating, is it a four-way stop or kind of the same way that it is today? Is it a street light or a roundabout? And they are evaluating all of those options. And then also as a part of this grant, DPW is working with the engineers to have a trail that connects from basically the village over to Lions Park along Sycamore Street, because there's not a strong road connect or a trail sidewalk connection because of the grades. And so they're looking at a boardwalk system to connect through the village to Lions Park. And then the other thing that was a part of this project is understanding the utilities. I mean, it is, as an old community, there are specific corridors that have a lot of utilities, and First Street is one of those corridors. We had a utility survey completed, and it is filled from border to border to border to border with utilities. And one of the critical items that we wanted to evaluate is the overhead transmission lines and understanding where are those located? What do we have the capability to do in the future, working with our utility company to understand, can we bury them? If we buried them, can we just bury them on First Street? Well, turns out we can't, because there's no room, because all of the other utilities are there. And so now we're going through this exercise of, all right, what is the most feasible and most responsible way to handle the overhead transmission lines? And those conversations will continue because we are just in understanding engineering and design right now. READY is having another round of grants come out. It's a program called READY 2.0. The application is due in the new year, and IEDC will be awarding each region $75 million. And the regions are from Central Indiana to Fort Wayne, Northwest Indiana area. And they will be vetting each of those projects. Zionsville is a part of the Central Indiana Regional Development Authority, which is the regional agency that is submitting for the READY 2.0 grant, and is currently working on receiving projects from every place from Zionsville to Pittsburgh to Cumberland to Indianapolis. So there is a wide variety of projects and interested municipalities that will be submitting for this. When Zionsville goes to apply, we will apply to basically work on implementation of the engineering of the road realignment, the trail connections, managing utilities, and figuring out how do we work towards implementation of this project, the Zionsville Gateway Master Plan, and still bring in a public plaza and have that all ready to go so that we can really bring in the private partners to do the work in this area. We have a couple projects that have been discussed over the past couple months. The first is DPW has an infrastructure need for bond improvements, not bond improvements, sewer improvements associated with the Holiday Farms neighborhood. And I know you all know that that neighborhood got built really fast, and the sewer capacity needs to move at that same pace. And so we're trying to understand how can we help support them with their sewer capacity needs. And then also Wild Air Development is a project that is along Marysville Road, north of Oak Street. This is a development that is being led by Old Town Companies. It's primarily a single-family residential neighborhood on the old Johnson family property. It's on both sides of Marysville. Single-family TIFs are allowed, and Heather can talk to what that means for a bond, but we typically don't look at that. We look at TIFs that would go towards multifamily, and they have proposed a senior living development and an apartment development, and then some retail and commercial spaces. Those areas would be isolated, and they would support a TIF bond that would fund 2 roundabouts on Marysville Road to handle the additional traffic demands for this new development. And so we're currently doing our due diligence for this request. I would expect that they come to the commission either later this month or in January and make a formal request to use TIF for those public infrastructure projects. And then from a financial standpoint, we have specific requirements by DLGF, which is a state agency that Cindy works very closely with. And we have several report out requirements that are filed with the state, and they are at they are in the first quarter and then in the last quarter of each year. And along the same lines, we'll have the Ready Grant application, and then Crow this past year helped us with a 5-year outlook for our TIF projections so that we can look forward rather than just 1 year, which is very helpful for these projects because they are not just 1-year projects, they're multi-year projects. So we'll have that updated and have that for the end of this quarter. And then we notify each of the other taxing entities in the Zionsville jurisdiction just to let them know if we're going to be using all of the TIF revenue for either debt obligation or the projects that have been informed. So those are requirements that we have. I would have added a whole bunch more to these, but I feel like I'm the first to go. And John, are we? Okay. Brian, could you try to speak? Oh,
Yep. Hello.
oh yeah. Okay, there, we can hear you.
Great.
Yeah. Um, so I know that I just dumped a whole bunch of information on you. The key takeaway from 2024 look forward and what the commission is going to be working on, it is primarily this South Village area and aligning whatever we are awarded for the next ready program with our development partners in this area. The area is, this land here is owned by a development company, and this is the Simplicity land. And then this land is owned by a development company, and this is the 21st Century Sheets property, and the Alber brothers have like a little garage back there for their projects too. And then this is the empty PNC bank lot. So we know we have some developers that are interested in working in Zionsville, and we know that we can rely on them continuing to pursue this vision, this master plan that was fleshed out. And so all of that cannot be done without a team. And that is why we have Cindy and the Crow team, and then also the legal team, because not only do we have checks and balances from the financial side, but also from the legal side. So Brian, I'm going to turn it over to you. And John, could you let him control the, okay.
If you tell
Brian,
me, I'll try.
I'll be your clicker, Brian, but I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, when I'm ready to click, I'll just say click.
Got it.
Good evening, everybody. Thanks for having us. Sorry about the light in the background. I have been trying to figure out how to jigger my camera to where that light doesn't blind you, so I'll just use my forehead as much as I can to prevent you from being blinded by the overhead light in my room here. But so we'll start with what is a redevelopment commission? Well, a redevelopment commission is a part of a town, a city. It can also be a part of a county that is specifically constituted in order to plan and effectuate the redevelopment of areas in the particular government unit's jurisdiction. It's granted certain powers to facilitate redevelopment that a mayor or county commissioners do not have by statute. It's an organization that really kind of sits in between an executive function as, like, for example, a mayor, and a fiscal authority, the town, which would be the town council, and it has mixtures and attributes of both. It's responsive to both the mayor and the fiscal authority, the council, in terms of the respective appointments. It is also responsive to the school district in the governmental unit in which it serves. Through the school district has a non-voting member that's appointed and participates in the deliberations of the redevelopment commission. We'll talk about some of the ways that, or some of the special powers that the Indiana state legislature has granted redevelopment commissions to allow you and other commissions to carry out redevelopment and planning efforts. Click. So RDC, so some of the significant powers that an RDC has is it can acquire and dispose of property, which most municipal units have that power in schools, towns, cities, but those powers are more restricted under 36-1-11 for a town. And we'll talk about the specific methods in which an RDC can acquire or dispose of property. But the appraisal requirements are much more restrictive in terms of what a town or what a town can do or what a city can do versus a redevelopment commission can do. The Redevelopment Commission also has some fiscal attributes in it as well in the terms of how it fits into the process of issuing tax increment finance, otherwise known as TIF bonds, which my colleague Heather will take you through that process. She is definitely an expert in that area. RDCs have specific powers to repair, maintain, and build structures within areas that are designated for redevelopment. They can also contract for local improvements. They can, like I said, they can enter into bonds. They can enter into leases. Again, they can enter into leases they have a lot more flexibility with respect to entering into leases than most municipal entities. They can also accept grants and loans, and they can make grants and loans. They can also enter into public-private partnership agreements in a more flexible manner than most municipal entities. And in fact, most local government P3 projects, they're developed under what's it's called the Build, Operate, Transfer statute. And most municipal entities choose to utilize an RDC just because of the flexibility it has with respect to acquiring and disposing of property, but also with respect to the process that it serves in issuing economic development incentives. So these are the kind of a summary of the most significant powers, but it's by no means exhaustive. And there has been some recent limitations on RDC powers as well. When those come up, we'll certainly be, we certainly will be happy to advise you of those, as we have. There's a new requirement that excess TIF funds, if you hit a certain coverage ratio on your outstanding indebtedness, 200%, that the fiscal authority then has additional say in how those funds are spent. There's also a new law that will be going on the books effective January 1st that require an RDC to beefing up its reporting requirements with respect to its budget. We've already been working on those issues, and I know the Crow's been working on those issues too. I think we're all still waiting on guidance on how that's actually going to play out in terms of how the Department of Local Government Finance, known as DLGF, if you're going to be a new redevelopment commission member, I can't see you sitting in the audience, but you'll hear that acronym a lot because DLGF is our and State Board of Accounts are the two authorities that examine the operation of redevelopment commissions, towns, in all local government units. So public meetings. So this is an interesting topic, and it's a good topic to talk about as you start your journey as RDC members, or even some of you that have been members of the RDC. So in general, the public has access to all meetings held by public agencies. It's commonly known as the open door law. So the RDC is a public agency for purposes of the statute and must comply with it. But the first question that you have to ask yourself is, well, what is a meeting? If you get together with three RDC members, get together to have dinner and just talk about whatever, that's not a public meeting. Social or chance gatherings are not, that are not intended to avoid the open door law, are not public meetings. This particular meeting is, even though it was noticed publicly and it's being recorded and the public is invited to attend, is not a public meeting, as it fits within the carve out for orientation of members of the governing body on their roles and responsibilities as public officials. Probably the most significant exception, I think, to open meeting requirements is any meeting to discuss industrial or commercial prospects that do not involve a conclusion as to recommendations, policy decisions, or final actions on the terms or request by a commercial prospect. And that rule means that you have freedom to, to listen and consider, but when it really comes to making decisions, those decisions must be made in a public meeting, not in an executive session, not in an off-the-record meeting, but in a public forum. Oh wait, I think I don't think I finished there. I didn't say
Oh,
click.
sorry.
Yeah. The other key thing
There
to
were so many words on the screen, I couldn't keep up.
yeah, I was a little. Those are small words, and probably are not the best for a PowerPoint. But it's important for everybody to understand what a public meeting is, and then the second inquiry is, what does it mean to take an official action? And that's a really important term, because even if because it helps define when you're having a public meeting or not, but it's also crucial in terms of executive sessions, which is a topic we're not going to cover tonight. But executive sessions, you can't take official actions in executive sessions either. And an official action, well, except for you can receive information, but you can't establish policy or make decisions or take a final action. Executive sessions, you can receive information and deliberate, but if you're going to make recommendations, you're going to make decisions, establish a policy, or take a final action. Again, that's all needs to be done in a public meeting. So land purchases and sales. This is probably this is one of the primary powers of an RDC, and it sets it apart from other governmental entities. But it still does have to follow a public process. It's not it's not a willy-nilly, hey, we're going to decide to sell we're going to purchase this land over here from this person, and then we're going to sell it to this other person. So the first thing that has to happen in deciding where the purchased land is, the RDC needs to determine the area of, within its body politic that needs redevelopment. And then it also needs to make findings and conclude that the redevelopment cannot be corrected by the private sector alone, and that public welfare would be served by acquiring the property. So when we have property acquisitions, that'll be one of the first things that you'll be asked to consider. So then the second criteria, the second part of the process is the RDC will create a map of the area with lists of properties to be acquired and the estimated cost of acquiring the properties. So then those are the two formal actions that the RDC then passes via resolution to start the process. Then the RDC's initial offer cannot be greater than the average of 2 appraisals. Appraisals are a funny word when it comes to Indiana statute, because I think most folks that are in government and play in this space, when they hear appraisal, they think of a formal appraisal like we would all get if we were trying to qualify for a home mortgage or a commercial loan for commercial property, vis-a-vis the MIA standard or other, professional appraisal standards. And the surprising answer is appraisals are not defined under Indiana law. There are some limited circumstances where an appraisal can be given by an actual employee of the body politic, but appraisal simply just means opinion of value. So anyone that can establish their bona fides as someone that would know or have some special knowledge with respect to property values can give appraisals. As a commercial, I also practice commercial real estate, and the folks at Ice Miller and other law firms that practice commercial real estate could conceivably fall within what it means, as a professional that could offer an opinion of value with respect to property. I think that would be a bad idea, because generally, if you're going to go outside of a formal certified, MIA appraisal, the best party that you can talk to is a commercial real estate broker, because, whereas, what I do is I help identify, manage, and assign risk in real estate transactions. real estate brokers manage, assess, and advocate for value, which is, again, if we're talking about an opinion of value, real estate, I think commercial real estate brokers, particularly for commercial real estate, have the best on-hand knowledge. One of the problems with an MIA certified appraisal is it's a backward-looking inquiry. So it's looking at sales comps that are always backward-looking, and sometimes those sales comps can be 2 or 3 years old. In the commercial property, pricing market moves much faster than that. So if you're really looking for something that's more updated, that's where you would go. So the reason that I wanted to talk about, what is an appraisal and what an appraisal doesn't mean is if you are a town and you're trying to buy property, you're locked in at whatever the value is, that says in the 2 appraisals. Your option, if you can't negotiate a voluntary agreement with the property owner, would be to exercise eminent domain, which is a long, slow, frustrating process for all involved. If you're a town and you really need a piece of property for utilities or from some other public purpose, that's what you're left with. However, a redevelopment commission has additional powers, and they can negotiate a final price that just must be approved by the RDC that can exceed the value of the 2 appraisals. There are some limits on that. So any agreement that makes payments for more than 3 years, or it's a final purchase price that exceeds $5 million, must be approved by the legislative/fiscal body of the unit. Again, it's this kind of in-between area that an RDC fits in, where it has certain attributes of the executive, the mayor, and it has certain attributes of the fiscal unit. And sometimes when those particular units then have approvals or say so once the RDC exceeds certain levels. Okay, so click selling land as an RDC. This is another area where the RDC has a clear advantage in being able to be very flexible and provide economic development incentives through selling land that simply a town or a municipal executive simply doesn't under other Indiana statutes. Again, there's limited public hearing requirements. It's all done through public meeting. You have to have formal public hearings also as a municipal entity versus as an RDC. Also, you still have the 2 appraisal requirements, but the appraisals are not open for public inspection. The RDC then publishes an offering sheet with minimum offering price that states the average of the 2 appraisals. So the public at least has to be informed of what the average is. The offering sheet then will contain dates that bids will be accepted, and then the bids themselves will be opened at public meeting. So in a public meeting and determining the best bids, the RDC also has more flexibility than a municipality or a town, in the sense that it can accept a bid, it can reject a bid, it can condition bids, and so it has a great deal of flexibility with respect to how it negotiates from there on out. But the most powerful power of the RDC when it comes to selling land is if no bids are accepted, then the RDC. Oh, sorry. Did somebody have a question?
No, that was me. I was tapping into your Zoom and it's reverberating. So I gotta mute myself.
Okay, sorry about that. Okay. So if the RDC rejects all bids, there is a 30-day period that the RDC cannot sell the property for less than the offering price. But after that 30-day period, after all bids are rejected, then the RDC can sell the property for any price or any condition it deems necessary to further the redevelopment plan. There's also no time limit on that. So once the property is bid, and if all bids, if no bids are either received or the RDC rejects the bids that were submitted after the 30-day period, the RDC has great flexibility to sell the property with any conditions or price that it deems necessary to further the redevelopment plan. And this procedure also applies to leases, which is another subject. Leases for, under the general municipal statute are really difficult. I've done a couple. I hope to never do them again. I much prefer if a municipal entity wants to lease land to a third party and control, retain ownership, they should transfer land to the RDC and work under the RDC statute. It's just a lot easier. And what's frustrating to me as somebody that's been doing this for a while with the regular municipal statute is I don't think it doesn't really change the outcome. It's just procedure that makes it difficult to get to the outcome that I think most people would think is reasonable. So click. Click. My clicker's not working. So understanding, the powers of the RDC, there's some general considerations with respect to these powers on how your powers can impact, particularly a private development, and when a private developer approaches the RDC about entering into a project. So, obviously, TIF financing is and Heather will get to the powers of TIF financing in a minute. But the RDC, by how it can work with land values and contribute land to a project at less than, the market value, if it's been properly bid, is a significant value in a developer's capital stack and is a significant economic development incentive. So, when you're thinking through whether you want to do whether you want to participate or help facilitate a redevelopment project, understand that if the incentive is contribution of land, it's a very powerful incentive, and then it can also factor in, the coordination of land sale can also then factor in with TIF financing to be a really powerful tool to facilitate and influence development in the areas that have been designated. So I think with that, I think that's my last slide, isn't it? Public-private partnerships. Right now, I don't believe that Zionsville has any true P3 projects. I know that there's been some approaches over the last couple of years, but they haven't really moved very far for various reasons. But the build, operate, transfer statute is a statute that's being used by a lot of municipalities to even further their redevelopment efforts. So I would suspect in the next 4 years, the new RDC that'll be constituted in January will probably have to seriously consider that type of project in the future, given how ubiquitous those projects are with others. With that, I'm going to pass the baton over to Heather James, and she's going to tell you all you need to know and probably things you don't want to know or never wanted to know about.
Thanks, Brian. And as Corey mentioned, I have some sort of plague, so that's why I'm not there with you. And I apologize for any coughing that comes along with this presentation. If folks have questions while I'm going through, feel free to interrupt me. Just holler at me and I'll quit rambling. So moving on to TIF. As you all know, I think TIF stands for Tax Increment Financing, and it is a tool that captures increases in assessed value from new development. So I think both of those words are important, increases and new, because everything that is currently out there gets put into the base, and we're only looking at capturing increases in AV from that new development and nothing else. I want to go over some key terms with you. A redevelopment district is the geographical area that's considered a special taxing district, because the taxpayers that live inside that district derive some special benefit by being located within it. but nobody actually realized they live in a special taxing district. So the redevelopment district is coterminous with the boundaries of the unit. So in Zionsville, it's the same as the Zionsville boundaries. The only exception to that is that county redevelopment districts do not include any cities or towns that have their own redevelopment commissions within the county. So for instance, Boone County obviously would not include Zionsville. And you can always capture increases in real property assessed value. And we can also capture designated depreciable personal property assessed value if we go through the steps to actually designate a taxpayer. But that is an overt step that needs to be taken while going through the TIF process. A couple other words that I just want you to know: economic development area, or often just shortened to EDA, is the geographical area where we actually expect there to be some sort of development. And TIF area, if you start looking through 36.714 to try to find the term TIF area, you will not find it. It's actually called an allocation area. And that is the area where we actually expect to see increases in AV and capture them. So the parcels that are designated where we're actually capturing those increases in AV. Corey, if you just want to go to the next slide for me, please. There we go. Okay. So on this slide, you can see that some condos and apartments can be assessed as commercial instead of residential. So apartments with 4 or more units and condos with 4 or more stories. And you do not need to qualify under the residential housing statute to take advantage of this sort of assessment. This has been heavily utilized for years as with a bond financing structure that we'll discuss later, that allows the town to avoid public bidding and provide bond proceeds directly to a developer and treat those housing projects as commercial. And then, as you've already heard, there's a relatively new law regarding residential housing, and that statute is utilized for housing or workforce housing that consists of single family dwelling units in reasonable proximity to employment for folks. So if you go on to the next slide, you will see all of the steps that are necessary on the left-hand side to create an allocation area and to set a base assessment date. So something I think is notable for everyone to understand is that the law used to only require adoption of the declaratory resolution, which is the first step in the process for the Redevelopment Commission to meet and adopt a declaratory resolution to set that base assessment date. And now you need to complete the entire process shown on the left, including filing the recorded confirmatory resolution with the Department of Local Government and Finance to trigger that action of setting the base assessment date. And that is a very important change because you want to make sure that all of the increases in assessed value that the Redevelopment Commission wants to capture from that new development are included in the increment and not going through to the base if you're using that for an incentive. So if a Redevelopment Commission gets through that entire process shown on the left-hand side by the last day of the calendar year, then it would set the base assessment date as of January 1, 2023. It's always the prior January 1. So if we don't get through that process until Q1 of 2024, then of course the base would be set as of January 1, 2024. So the steps on the left-hand side that you see are the Redevelopment Commission meeting and adopting their declaratory resolution. Then we go to the Plan Commission to adopt a Plan Commission order. Then we go to the council, publish a 10-day notice, and have your municipal advisor prepare a tax impact statement that explains to the overlapping taxing units what the actual impact of creation of the allocation area will be. And then back to the Redevelopment Commission to hold a public hearing and consider a confirmatory resolution, at which point they can confirm what was done at the declaratory resolution stage. Now, if you want to go, yeah, sorry.
Just a quick question or building on that a little bit. How long does that process typically take?
That's a great question. So it depends on meeting schedules, of course, and it depends on newspapers and their deadlines and how often they publish. So it varies throughout the state, but I would say 60 to 90 days, closer to 90 is more typical. But sometimes folks really want to rush things and say you know you're going to be moving dirt on something early in 24, and so you want to get that base assessment date set in 23. And so sometimes folks will hold a bunch of special meetings and get things done quicker than the 90 days.
And then one other question is, when we send the impact statement, that goes to the other jurisdictions that have taxing capabilities.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering if you can just touch on schools, because there's a lot of times there's questions around how does TIF impact schools?
Yeah, so that so that tax impact statement would certainly go to the schools, along with all the other overlapping taxing units, so that they can see what the municipal advisor expects that impact to be. But as you'll recall, a couple of years ago, the legislature created the but-for test, which basically says that but for creation of this allocation area, those new property taxes in the area would not have been generated. So the theory is, I'm sorry. So the theory is that because we're talking about new development that wouldn't otherwise be there if not for the TIF incentive, that the school is not missing out on anything, because we're incentivizing this new development and the TIF is generating or helping to cause that TIF to be generated. So everything that was flowing through to the school before stays in that base and continues to go to the overlapping taxing units on a pro rata basis. And it's just the increases in AV from the new development that's coming from a project that's generated because the TIF is there as an incentive. So the theory is that the school is not harmed because, again, those new property taxes wouldn't be there without the TIF. And sorry, just going back for a second to the last slide, if you look on the right-hand side, those are the additional things that are required. If there is a single-family residential housing TIF area, the legislature keeps kind of tweaking that, and used to require actual approval by the overlapping, by the schools in the area, and that's no longer the case, but it does require this sort of consultation with folks in the neighborhood and additional public meeting and public hearing. Okay, so on to the next slide. I mentioned this already, that we can always capture real property increases, but there are also depreciable personal property increases for things like industrial, that can be captured if you name a taxpayer by name in the declaratory resolution and officially designate them. So on the next slide, you'll see that the term of an allocation area has changed over the years. So when you go and look back at existing allocation areas that may have been expanded over the years, you have to take a look at when they were actually created to understand when they expire. So the current rule is that any area established after July 1, 2008 expires 25 years after the date that any obligation payable from that area is incurred. So if you create a TIF area and you're using TIF just on a pay-as-you-go basis and you have no obligations payable from that TIF, then the clock on the area has not started to run yet. And then residential TIF areas that I mentioned have a maximum life of 20 years. That's a change from the previous statute. It used to be 25 and they changed it to 20 last year. And these timeframes are obviously important because it impacts the length of the bonds that can be issued and how long costs can be spread out over time. Okay, so on the next slide, just to reiterate exactly how TIF is collected. Existing assessed value, as I've said a couple times, is built into the base as of that base assessment date and continues to flow through to those overlapping taxing units. And then the increases in AV over the base become the incremental AV that's captured by the Redevelopment Commission. And once you multiply that increased AV by the property tax, then voila, that's the TIF. and that TIF gets put into an allocation fund for each particular allocation area. So every property owner that lives in the allocation area continues to pay their taxes as usual. The increment is just captured and held in the TIF allocation fund instead of being held in a different fund and flowing through the normal course. And I always like to point out that creating a TIF area does not give the Redevelopment Commission any more power over the area. It's not as if they have some sort of eminent domain power or anything of that nature. The change is simply that the increases in AV in that area are captured instead of flowing through to the overlapping taxing units. So on the next slide, you'll see that once the Redevelopment Commission is capturing TIF, they can use it on a pay-as-you-go basis. I like to think of this as a 4-prong test. Number one, the expenditure needs to be something that's capital in nature, meaning it's something that is in fact capital and not an operating expense. The expenditures need to be in the economic development plan. So when the Redevelopment Commission starts the process to create a TIF area and they adopt that declaratory resolution, attached to that declaratory resolution is an economic development plan that outlines what you expect to see happen in the area. And also I should note, if you're moving through the residential housing TIF process, then in addition to that economic development plan, there would be a housing program attached to the declaratory resolution to explain what you think the housing is going to look like in the area. Okay, so capital in nature and in the plan. The third prong is that it needs to have an economic development purpose. Is that defined? No. So what is an economic development purpose? I think reasonable minds can disagree. It used to be, I'd say, a big focus on infrastructure, and more you see a lot of quality of place sort of expenditures, because the State Board of Accounts will defer to the Redevelopment Commission to some degree as the finder of fact. I think it's very important to paper your resolutions to overtly state, this is why we think this has an economic development purpose, and potentially even attach, say, letters from developers or employers or other folks in the community that drive home the point that you see a clear economic development purpose. And then the final part of the test is that the project is in, serving, or benefiting the area. So it doesn't need to physically be inside the area, but you do need to be able to show how it's serving or benefiting. And if you're utilizing the economic development statute to incent a particular developer, then that burden is higher than in serving or benefiting, and it is in or physically connected to, which is obviously a stricter test. Okay, so on to the next slide. Oh, sorry, you have a question?
Yep. Actually, this is a question from a viewer. You've used the term allocation area, economic development area, and TIF district. So are TIF districts and allocation areas the same?
Okay, so the district is actually coterminous with the town of Zionsville. So the whole town is the redevelopment district. The economic development area is a geographical area within the town that the Redevelopment Commission thinks that there will be some sort of development. Now, the allocation area can either be coterminous with, and by the way, I'm sorry, I should state that there can be multiple economic development areas throughout Zionsville, right? You could say on the north end, we think we're going to have development for this purpose, and then over here, we're going to have development, and that's a separate EDA, and you can have them all over. And then within the EDA, you could either have a coterminous allocation area so that it is literally the same exact geographical area as the larger economic development area, or you could have one small allocation area where the increase in AV is actually going to be captured within the EDA, or you could have multiple allocation areas within the EDA. So for instance, if you think, let's say on the north end of town, we think there's going to be 4 different multifamily housing sort of developments, and we're going to have 4 different developers that we're working with. Then you might have one large economic development area up there because you see that whole area developing, but potentially you would create 4 separate allocation areas within that EDA so that you could have 4 separate funds and you could track those dollars and do 4 separate deals with different developers and be able to very clearly see the increases in AV and those discrete separate allocation areas. Does that make sense?
Yes. So if on this map, we're showing 8 different areas.
And that's very typical.
Yeah. So this whole map would be the TIF district.
The redevelopment district, yes.
Right.
And then you've got these multiple EDAs, which are highlighted in different colors. And then within those EDAs, you either have allocation areas that are coterminous with those or smaller allocation areas within them.
Okay.
Got a question.
Yes, sir.
It's a little off on, but we're talking about a new comprehensive plan in the future. Should the comprehensive plan designate the coordinate on the EDAs rather than have a situation where the plan calls for one sort of development, later on the RDC might designate something different?
Yes, so for everyone online, the question is, the town will be working on a comprehensive plan, and should these economic development areas or other redevelopment potentially areas like the Gateway area, the South Village, be incorporated into the comprehensive plan. And Mike Dale actually is listening to the presentation and texting me along the way. He is the director of the planning department here in town, and he and I work very closely on our projects. And I expect us to be coordinating all the way through on the comprehensive plan once that initiative gets started. So you're absolutely correct. Yes, it should be. And it will be.
And just so everybody's clear, when I went through those steps to create a TIF area, the steps are really basically the same to amend a TIF area. So if, for instance, there's a project that's not in your economic development plan and you'd like to add it, then it's very simple to do that. You just go through that process that's outlined on the earlier slide. I will say, however, if you're going to go through that process, it's a good time to ask yourself, are there any other changes that we should make so that you're not having to go through it again and again and again, right? Okay. Any more questions or should I continue, Corey?
Yep, keep it on.
Okay, so I graduated from law school, started at Ice Miller almost 16 years ago, and told my parents I was going to be a bond lawyer, and they legitimately thought that I was going to bail people out of jail. I'm from the region, so I guess that's probably part of it. But when I explain to people that I'm a bond lawyer or a public finance attorney, they don't often know what that means. So a very simple explanation is that bonds are basically mortgages. It's very similar to a mortgage that we have on our homes. The concept is the same. There's something that is expensive that we want to fund now, but we don't have the cash on hand to pay the full amount up front. So we spread the costs over time. The governmental entity basically just takes on debt like you would a mortgage to finance the costs of a capital project. And bonds really are relevant to everyone from birth. Does the hospital that you were born in, the roads you drive on, the schools you attended, the sewer and water infrastructure that you use every day, all of that is financed with municipal bonds. And so, I mean, we're all very well aware that municipalities are facing great infrastructure needs all across the country. If you drive in downtown Indianapolis, there's potholes all over the place. So it really makes financial and political sense to spread these costs out over a long period of time, because the improvements are going to be used for years to come by a multitude of taxpayers. So bond financings allow you to match the timing of bond payments to the delivery of services and capital investments and spread those costs. So moving on to the next slide, you'll note that one of the powers that the Redevelopment Commission has is to issue bonds. So I'm going to just go over a quick primer of different types of bonds that would be relevant to the town. So of course, there are revenue bonds that are payable from a specific revenue stream like sewer or water rates. And oftentimes in new developments, infrastructure needs are absolutely essential. So sometimes you'll have a revenue bond and potentially another type of bond to fund serious infrastructure costs. Property tax-based bonds, often referred to as general obligation bonds that are payable from an ad valorem property tax levy. Those are most often used for public projects. Local income tax bonds, those were formerly CAGIT, COIT, CEDIT, LOIT, EDIT. All of those local bonds were then, or I'm sorry, all of those local income taxes were consolidated several years ago. But the economic development lit is very broad and flexible. So we see a fair amount of those sorts of bonds. Special taxing district bonds. I mentioned to you earlier that the redevelopment district is a special taxing district. So the Redevelopment Commission has the ability to issue bonds payable from a special benefits tax, which is a property tax levy on the redevelopment district. So it functions very much like a general obligation bond, but through the Redevelopment Commission as opposed to through the town. Lease bonds, they don't count against the 2% statutory debt limit because the Indiana Supreme Court ruled a long time ago that if there is a lease between a redevelopment commission and a body that we would create called a redevelopment authority, then it technically is not debt. So that basic structure is really the way that all school financings in the state of Indiana are done. If you've ever done a deal or heard of a financing with a building corporation, it really functions the same way. And then I think maybe on the next slide, there are really two, oh, no, that's just some more information about leases. Okay, sorry about that. Just go back one for me, Corey, please. There are two main types of tax increment bonds. There are tax increment revenue bonds that are issued under the redevelopment statute for public projects that the Redevelopment Commission is going to handle the construction of them. And those need to be in serving or benefiting a specific area. The issue with those bonds is that the security is not very strong, right? A potential bond purchaser is going to look at a TIF area and say, wow, that source of security is a little bit uncertain. So they would probably require some sort of a backup of another revenue fund. And also probably need some sort of a debt service reserve fund or something of the like. The other type of bond financing that we use all the time to provide incentives to developers is the economic development revenue bonds. So if a governmental unit wants to issue bonds and provide proceeds directly to a developer and not have to publicly bid the project, which saves a lot of money and time, then we utilize the EDC statute. The town issues the EDC bonds through the council upon the recommendation of the Economic Development Commission, and the Redevelopment Commission pledges their TIF to the Economic Development Commission bonds. Oftentimes these bonds are purchased directly by the developer, so you'll hear them called developer-backed bonds. Sometimes there is a third-party purchaser instead, but again, that third-party purchaser is going to look at that revenue stream as somewhat uncertain. So they are probably going to require a minimum coverage on an annual basis, a reserve, and probably some other sort of backup, like a minimum taxpayer agreement or a guarantee from the developer. But that structure is the way that most developer deals are done around the state, to utilize that EDC statute for a developer purchase bond. Those deals are highly negotiated and often involve clawbacks to mitigate the risk to the municipality and to hold developers to their word that they will in fact build what they say they're going to build. And they're great because to the extent that they don't deliver, then they, as the bond purchaser, just simply don't get paid back. So it's a really a nice way to mitigate risk, but provide an incentive to a developer to build in your community.
Heather, earlier this evening, I mentioned a project where we're anticipating a TIF request for Wild Air.
Mhm.
And with that, bonds would be issued.
Mhm.
And their request is that it would be a developer purchased bond. And I use that in another instance when I was describing the budget where we're just managing a developer's bond. Can you talk about that language of developer purchased or developer bought bond compared to a town bond or a tax exempt bond?
Yeah, so a town bond is typically going to be it's really a question of what are we funding and who is in charge of the project. So if the town is issuing a TIF bond to pay for, say, infrastructure improvements that the town is going to own, then that would be a very typical use of just a standard tax increment revenue bond. If, however, there's a multifamily housing project and a developer comes in and says, hey, I would really like an incentive of X millions of dollars to be able to handle the construction. We want these dollars to come directly to us so that we can use them for our project. Then that's when we would look at the developer purchase bond. It's a state law sort of a thing, so it's different all across the country. But my understanding is that in some states like Illinois, you literally could write a check to a private entity and say, you know, here's the money that you can use for your project. Can't do that in Indiana. So instead, we go through this legal process to be able to provide them the dollars directly so that they can then construct the project themselves. And it functions very much like a long-term tax abatement because they are paying their property taxes like they always do, but because they're paying property taxes on a new development in a potentially new TIF area, but it could certainly be an existing TIF area, that is generating TIF, and that TIF is utilized to then pay them back as the bond purchaser. So they're serving that dual role of developer and bond purchaser. And so it's really their TIF that's paying them back, but not up front. It's over the life of the bonds. So it's not as if they get a cash infusion. And that's why I say it functions like a tax abatement because they're paying in and getting paid back for 20, 25 years, something like that. Does that answer your question, Corey?
Yep. Wow. Yes. We have, the RDC has multiple bonds, and Becca gave a great presentation at the RDC meeting last month. So if you get a chance, watch the YouTube and her presentation on where all of that debt obligation is, when it's set to sunset, and how it all kind of weaves into the financial side of what Heather is talking about.
Corey, I just wanted to add that I would say that the best TIF area is one that's about to expire because that means it's done its job, right? So once the TIF area is done and it sunsets, then all of that increase in AV that was being captured by the Redevelopment Commission to use for their projects or on a pay-as-you-go basis, then goes back and flows through to those overlapping taxing units. So the schools and those other overlapping taxing units do eventually get the benefits, just delayed during the life of the TIF area.
Thanks. Well, you can see it in our budget that we approved, and I presented in the October RDC meeting, and I presented it to council on November 20th.
Was that for 1 year or how far did it go?
The budget that I presented showed basically 2023 year end, 2024 budget, and then it showed 3 years of projection. So what we did was we took Crow's 5-year TIF projection and we overlaid everything in, because again, these projects aren't 1-year projects. They're, 3, 4-year, 5-year projects. So we are looking at things consistently. And then Becca's presentation last month and the budget presentation in October also had the sunset dates. But if you have any specific ones, I see that Tim has his budget sheets printed out. So I'm glad that they're here. But this would be the time where I would have gone into, okay, now how are we doing all of this? And I would have walked you through what I did at the beginning. So are there any other questions that you have? We are pushing up against our 7:30 closeout time. And I know that you all have been, you're like, wow, where did our time disappear to? Because this has been so fun. What other questions do you have? I mean, you have attorneys, you have municipal advisors, you have administrators, you have the RDC president here. What else can we answer or help you understand? What? Two? So, yeah, the question presented was, is there a limit to TIFs on what they can ask for? The only limit really is what Heather and Brian talked about on how you can use, and it has to qualify for certain expenses. And then today it's a 25-year maximum. And that's really where it comes down to a public-private partnership, a negotiation between the town and the private developer. And one example is how a recent project was negotiated was the farm. That is a TIF project, and it's a developer purchased bond. And so all of the TIF revenue that comes in flows to that developer to pay his debt obligation, but for 5% of that, because council and the RDC negotiated with them to say, you can use 95% of the revenue that comes in during this 25 years. In previous municipalities that I've worked with, we negotiated 50-50 splits, 75-25 splits, 100%. Really, it gets down to how much is needed to complete the project. And then do you use the whole duration of 25 years and split it accordingly, or not at all? Or do you shorten the duration? Like 25 is your maximum, but if you can get everything done in a shorter period of time, maybe it is only a 10-year duration. And Heather, that would be something that would be outlined in the resolutions as we go through the approval process, correct?
Right. When you create a declaratory resolution, it includes your base assessment date. And also at that point, if you wanted to have a sunset that's earlier than statutorily required, you could certainly put that in there. And I've seen people do that, very seldom, but I have seen it done.
From each area.
for folks online, the question is, could we use the funds to fund the TIF revenue funds to fund a fire station, a fourth fire station? A fire station is a public use, and so the use qualifies, right, as a TIF revenue stream. The area may not qualify because these EDAs that are created, though it is an isolated area, so we can only capture the funds and spend the funds in that area.
If you could, if the redevelopment commission felt comfortable that it was serving and benefiting the area.
Oh, yes, that's right. Thank you.
But no problem. But there is a question of the economic development purpose. And I will tell you, I've certainly seen TIF used for a fire station, but State Board of Accounts has been cracking down on things like police cars, fire, things of that nature. So you'd have to really be able to articulate in your resolution the economic development purpose and also how it does in fact serve and benefit the area where the funds are generated.
So in each of, when we go through the process, this very first step, number one, Heather, where it says we have a redevelopment or economic development plan. In that plan then is how we're going to spend the money and how it will be used. Or
your best guess at the time.
Yeah.
It's what your intentions are when you adopt the resolution. Yes. Mm-hmm.
So is that possible to add in public protection?
After the fact, after it's gone through all of that, Heather?
I couldn't hear the question, Corey. I'm sorry.
Oh, I'm sorry. The question is, if we go through this process in year one and create an economic or redevelopment plan, and we get approval from all of these bodies and work towards that, in year 5, could that be amended to change how the funds are used for the economic development plan, or how it aligns?
Yes, absolutely. And that happens all the time. These economic development plans are amended constantly. And I will say that if you're going through that amendment process and you are not doing anything that impacts an allocation provision, and by that I mean you're doing nothing that impacts actual financials, for instance, just adding a project to a plan, then you do not need to have your municipal advisor prepare a tax impact statement. But you would otherwise go through the same steps of going to the redevelopment commission, plan commission, council, and then public hearing for the redevelopment commission again.
I will say that as we're looking at the South Village area, specifically, actually the fire chief and police chief and I just met last week to talk about how does this change how they would keep people safe. And so we started talking about what does it mean to have a mixed use district, residents and commercial activities, parking garages to support that. And we're coordinating, and we'll be, talking about public safety as we go forward, definitely. John, are there any questions online that have been written in by chance in the chat? Any other questions? Well, yeah.
You talked to some of the possible, within TIF, like some of the potential leveraging of development agreements that might be able to be added to ensure certain improvements, amenities materialize versus leaving them more open-ended and not materialize.
The question is, how can we basically work with a developer to make sure the neighbor public infrastructure gets materialized, gets done. I suppose, Brian, I'm going to start, and then you can fix anything I say wrong, and then you can add on too. Sound okay?
Yes.
So right now, we really don't have any public-private partnerships where we have a development agreement that walks alongside a bond resolution, an economic development plan. But going forward, we will be. Actually, Brian and I were just talking about this last week, last week, where we want to have a development agreement that outlines the commitments that are being made to be very clear, which may not be written in stone and the developer would be held accountable to in the bond resolutions that are approved, because that's kind of the money side and the commitment side. And the reason why we're going through that, a good example would be the Holiday Farms project. They had, I wasn't here, but they had multiple public meetings, and there is this, there at one of the meetings, or maybe multiple of the meetings, there was this discussion of a bridge over Michigan Road. And while it is a potential TIF expense, it's not feasible. But yet the public held to that. And but there's no development agreement to go along with this that would give the RDC or the town teeth to hold them accountable. Can you add to that, Brian?
Yeah, so I think in general, and I think I'd be interested in Heather's opinion. If you don't have a project or a project agreement, development agreement with a developer on a TIF deal, the sort of the incentive or how you keep the developer honest with respect to the TIF offering is they will have obligations with respect to the bonds, even if they don't purchase the bonds themselves. Obviously, if they purchase the bonds themselves, it's probably financed, and so they're going to have obligations to build something that generates the increment, and that's something that's probably pretty specific in terms of their financing on the back end. With respect to just the municipal bond, there's typically what's called a taxpayer agreement that requires a creditworthy entity to pay the difference, so to speak, between the taxes that the new construction generates and the payment on the bonds. So there is fiscal. Would you agree with that, Heather? That there's fiscal discipline that some municipalities rely upon only.
Certainly, and we can build in clawbacks with any of these negotiated deals. For instance, you might say that the developer has to create 20 jobs with wages at a certain level by a certain date. And if they don't, then a certain portion of the TIF is rescinded, or they have to complete X portion of their project, or perhaps they're not able to draw down on the bond proceeds unless and until they've put in $3 million of their own money or finished phase one. There's any number of ways to negotiate these incentives to hold folks accountable on the front end, or to not let them have access to their funds until they prove that they're going to keep up their end of the bargain.
Well, in fact, I mean, we included a development agreement in a developer purchase bond offering last year, didn't we? I think we did. Yep. Mm-hmm. It wasn't Holiday Farms; it was the farm, right?
Yes.
Yeah, different set of developers, different project, but there's a development agreement that has requirements for the developer to construct certain phases, certain percentages of TIF split between the town and the developer. Also, in the context of the Creekside deals, even though since those are straightforward land, or well, not straightforward, but those are the incentive there is the sale of land versus specific TIF for specific projects. All of those agreements have very precise requirements with respect to what is built. And there are clawbacks in those agreements to where if, construction doesn't commence or isn't complete by a certain outside date, that the land goes back to the RDC. So, but it's a process, and it's something that I know that Corey has been talking about doing, is making sure that on a going forward basis we have development agreements in place that's a little more specific than what's been done previously.
And then I think just to close that out is the RDC is one commission in the town. The plan commission, these developers have to go and get their land use and development plan approved. And some of these projects have special zoning or a planned unit development where they have additional commitments. I've also worked in the past with municipalities where we actually use in the building inspectors too for like final occupancy. Like if you want final occupancy, you need to follow through on these commitments. So while the RDC is one avenue for accountability, we also have some other avenues in the town as well.
So you mentioned the EDA areas with the gardens, one of them, and you mentioned the problem of sewage and the need that could be something that this would partnership for. But with what you said, that this is money would have to be used in that specific area. So now we have to find a place within that area to restore, and we extend this area to maybe go along Christian Road, or.
So the question is, with Holiday Farms and the slide that I presented about potential upcoming projects, is helping that sewer capacity. If we use TIF, we could amend the EDA area to run the route of the sewer improvements, or we can do whatever Heather advises.
I didn't know that.
I have in the past worked on projects where it comes after and it's adjacent to another TIF. And so projects are amended, the area is amended to capture. Yep, she said contiguous. Heather, would that be the key language?
If it's a redevelopment bond, it just needs to be serving or benefiting. If we're talking about the improvement itself being contiguous, if it were an EDC bond, it would need to be contiguous. Yeah, it would need to be physically connected. But because we're talking about a public improvement that the RDC would handle, so long as it's serving and benefiting, it would be appropriate to spend those dollars outside of the area.
So the same thing as the fire.
And TIF has, TIF does support other bonds that the town has taken out. So there's a sewer bond, and the TIF area for like the village area does support to pay the sewer bond, so it's that's why we have a municipal advisor team, that because they are the ones that can tell us, okay, how can we layer all of this and make something marketable to that. Tim or Becca, do you want to come to the mic and add more to that?
I think you got it. Just like what Heather said as well.
Okay. Well, I respect everybody's time, and thank you for tapping in online and coming. It's so nice to see everyone. This is going to be online and on YouTube. I'm accessible. RDC members are accessible. If you have any future questions, feel free to email us or give us a call. The information for Brian and Heather are on the slide deck that will be online. And my email is csharp@zionsville-in.gov. And we're pretty easy to get a hold of. Thank you for coming out.
Thank you
Thanks,
all.
Brian. Thanks, Heather.
Yeah, good to see you.
All right, bye.